Well, good evening, everyone. Just to tell you, my lecture tonight will be, it has 7 parts. I'll do an overview at first about Wordsworth. Then I'm going to do a look at the Prelude, at his lyrical ballads, at his preface to lyrical ballads, at some poems from his 1807 volume. The last poem we'll look at is Tintern Abbey, and then I'll end with a retrospective about Wordsworth. I intend to make 3 points, as I hope I will, that what is important about Wordsworth. First of all, he brought to our attention, perhaps for the first time in literature, the importance of childhood. He also stressed the role of memory. And finally, the importance of our connection to the earth, to nature. So with that said, let's embark on William Wordsworth, our contemporary. I think he's the most original and representative poet of the age we now call the Romantic period. All but a very few poets have affected our consciousness and our culture as much as has Wordsworth. Either directly or by way of his influence on other writers, he really changed the way we see and describe the natural world and also ourselves, as well as the ways in which we respond to what we see. He made a difference. He is well worth reading. Okay, so now we'll launch into his intro. He wrote a vast number of poems. He wrote over 60 years. So what we're getting tonight is the barest sampling of what he wrote. His range is both very good and very bad. He almost has a bipolar quality to his writing. The first half of his career, he wrote extraordinary poetry. And then in the second half, something went wrong and he became a little dull and perhaps even a little prosy. People speculate on what went wrong. He had 5 children. Did this interfere? Did the fact that he had a very happy marriage in many ways interfere? That in his early life, he poured his libido into his poetry. And once he had Mary and loved her and lived with her, perhaps he poured it into her. There's also speculation that his greatest period of poetry came when he was friendly and in touch with Samuel Taylor Coleridge. They were a great friendship, a great literary collaboration for a number of years, and then things went wrong and their relationship was never the same again. So we don't know why, but the first half of his poetry, and it's a large half, is extraordinary. He spent 36 years, one critic said, of climbing to the summit and 44 years on the descent. He was the first to tell us how we are shaped by our childhood environment. Of course, Freud took that up a lot later. He was also the first poet who made us aware of the importance of memory and the first to make us aware of the need for our connection to the natural world. The greatest poem he wrote is the Prelude. It's too long for us to cover tonight. It was in 14 books. It's an epic. Now, other epics like the Iliad and the Odyssey, they were about heroes. Spencer wrote The Fairy Queen in the 16th century. That was about royalty and fairy tales. Milton wrote his great epic of Paradise Lost. That was about the ways of God to man. And what was unusual about Wordsworth's epic, it was about himself. It was the first original autobiography, and it was in verse, blank verse, and it was unprecedented. Wordsworth was a voracious reader. He was steeped in Shakespeare, in Milton, and he led mostly what I would call an itinerant life. He never really held down a job. He was lucky enough to have been given an 8,000-pound legacy, which enabled him to live. He and Mary and also his sister had taken care of a child of a friend. for a number of years, brought the child up. And so he got this legacy, which enabled him to write. He was a great walker. They walked and walked. Some modern people have estimated that he walked 175,000 miles in his lifetime. Walking for him in nature and in natural surroundings was an inspiration. He got mostly bad reviews in his lifetime. He was writing very different kind of verse, of course, and it's always hard for people to get used to something different. His verse was called Miserable Trash. Another critic wrote of his verse, "This will never do." Someone else said, "It's beyond all conception dull." The interesting thing about Wordsworth is it didn't bother him. He knew he was great. He knew he was writing for posterity. He believed in the immortality of his work. He had no other than his family and Coleridge and his sister Dorothy. The reviews were almost uniformly bad. And that's because he was writing such different kinds of verse. He outlived all of the great romantics. Byron, Shelley, and Keats all died. Keats in his 20s, Byron and Shelley in their 30s. And Wordsworth lived 2 weeks beyond his 80th birthday and died in 1850 on the 23rd of April, which is Shakespeare's birthday. So I suppose that's appropriate. In 1798, he began writing the poem that developed into his supreme achievement, the Prelude. It's now available in 3 different versions. They're very close because he was an inveterate reviser. He could never leave anything alone. He kept working on it. And he first finished it in 1799, and we'll probably look at excerpts from the 1799 version. It was never published in his lifetime. It was published only after his death and given its name by his wife, Mary. She called it the Prelude. It goes from his early life, from his infancy, through his days at grammar school, his visionary experience as a child. It covers his time in the French Revolution, his walking tours. It's his life, his early life. It's an epic about himself. And one of the things that it contained were instances of what he called spots of time. These were mystical moments. These were moments when he said he could see into the heart of things. He called his spots of time the hiding places of my power. They framed his identity. They were like joints of his self. And the first early part of the Prelude is, of course, about his early childhood. It contains a lot of observation of natural phenomena in which he sees the world as something not alien at all, but connected to him. Many people today, I think of the world as alien. He never did. His persistent theme is the way human beings come to feel at home in the world and the stresses that tend to alienate us from it. But these spots of time are moments when we see into the life of things. And so we're going to start off tonight looking first, and we'll start with this first slide, a view of the Lake Country, the country he was born in. Next slide. First of all, this is, of course, the young Wordsworth, the old Wordsworth, but now we're in the lake. That's the young Wordsworth. That's the first half. This is the second half. He's, by the way, buried in Westminster Abbey. You can visit his tomb there. All right, so now let's go to the Lake Country. This is it. I've been there twice. It is just like that. There's nothing exaggerated about that picture. And he grew up in this beautiful spot, and he felt it was a privilege to have grown up among these beautiful and awesome forms of nature, mountains, valleys, lakes, and above all, the wind. So what I've done, and the Prelude is a gigantic work. It's 14 books long. It's longer than Paradise Lost. I've taken a few excerpts, which I'm going to show on the screen and discuss them with you so that you can see the excerpts. And the first, give us the first slide from the Prelude. Notice, oh, there is blessing in this gentle breeze, a visitant that while it fans my cheek, doth seem half conscious of the joy it brings from the green fields and from yon azure sky. Whate'er its mission, it's interesting, the wind has a mission like a person. The soft breeze can come to none more grateful than to me, escaped from the vast city. For Wordsworth, the city is always a bad place, where I long had pined, a discontented sojourner. Now free as a bird to settle where I will. I want to just comment that this is all blank verse, 5 iambic stresses to a line, the same verse form used by Milton in Paradise Lost, used by Shakespeare in all his plays and in all his sonnets. Next slide. Another part of the Prelude, dear liberty, yet what would it avail but for a gift that consecrates the joy? For I, methought while the sweet breath of heaven was blowing on my body, felt within a correspondent breeze. So the wind is blowing and his body is responding to it, that gently moved with quickening virtue, but is now become a tempest, a redundant energy, vexing its own creation, thanks to both and their congenial powers. The next. Well, he then had to seek a theme. Every work of art has a theme. And he says here, sometimes what I put up are the lines that I've taken from the Prelude. In case you have a copy of it in front of you, it doesn't matter, I'm putting it up on the screen. Sometimes it suits me better to invent a tale from my own heart. This is his theme, a tale from his own heart, more near akin to my own passions and habitual thoughts. And then in the next excerpt, you see there, he's so grateful to where he was born. And we have here also on the screen, one of the many watercolors done by Constable, Turner, many Cotman, many of the great artists of the time of the Lake Country. And he thanks the landscape he was born in. Fair seed time, he calls it a seed time, as if a seed was planted in him that grew, had my soul, and I grew up, fostered alike by beauty and by fear. And I'm going to show you how some of the excerpts show him fostered by beauty and some by fear, much favored in my birthplace, and no less in that beloved vale to which ere long we were transplanted. Okay, next. Sometimes now we're going to get to the first of these episodes in the Prelude where he has a direct connection with nature. And this has to do with him going out hunting for woodcocks. And what he did was take a bird from someone else's catch. Sometimes it befell in these night wanderings that a strong desire overpowered my better reason, and the bird, which was the captive of another's toil, became my prey. So he's offended. And when the deed was done, I heard among the solitary hills low breathings coming after me, and sounds of indistinguishable motion, steps almost as silent as the turf they trod. Many people today feel they live in a universe they have no connection with. First of all, it's covered with concrete and asphalt. And we live in cities where every square inch is covered with buildings. He is right feeling nature breathing and remonstrating with him. Next, another episode is when he climbed the rocks, shouldering the naked crag. Oh, at that time, while on the perilous ridge I hung alone, with what strange utterance did the loud, dry wind blow through my ear? Sometimes I wonder why people rock climb or why people do these things. And this is the answer. They feel some kind of connection. The sky seemed not a sky of earth, and with what motion moved the clouds. Well, next, he now becomes philosophical about his observations. Wordsworth is never one only to describe. He also wants to think about what he's seen. And so he thinks about the human being, dust as we are. The immortal spirit grows like harmony in music. There is a dark, inscrutable workmanship that reconciles discordant elements, makes them cling together in one society. Then he thinks about all of these things that came together to making up himself, the calm existence that is mine when I am worthy of myself. Praise to the end, thanks to the means which nature deigned to employ, whether her fearless visitings or those that came with soft alarm, like hurtles light opening the peaceful clouds, or she would use severer interventions. Ministry, notice the word ministry, it's religious. He wouldn't have used the word God or religion in this, but nature becomes a force which has a ministry more palpable as best might suit her aim. And the next is the episode of the stolen boat. I mean, I guess like most boys, he did a few things that were wrong. And this night he took someone's boat that was moored up and went out on the lake. I dipped my oars into the silent lake, and as I rose upon the stroke, my boat went heaving through the water like a swan. When, from behind that craggy steep, till then the horizon's bound, a huge peak, black and huge, as if with voluntary power instinct, upreared its head. I struck and struck again, and growing still in stature, the grim shape towered up between me and the stars. And still, for so it seemed, with purpose of its own and measured motion, like a living thing, strode after me. This is one of his spots of time. Well, in the next, he returns the boat and he thinks about it. That spectacle for many days, my brain worked with a dim and undetermined sense of unknown modes of being. This is not a dead world. This is a world that is alive with a spirit, huge and mighty forms that do not live like living men, moved slowly through the mind by day and were a trouble to my dreams. Next, now we have one of the most famous episodes of the Prelude. It's the ice skating episode. And you see on your screen the one of the watercolors of the period of a frozen lake. So the lakes freeze in the winter and he goes out skating. All shod with steel, we hissed along the polished ice in games confederate. The precipices rang aloud, the leafless trees and every icy crag tinkled like iron, while far distant hills into the tumult sent an alien sound of melancholy, not unnoticed. And now in the next, the skating episode goes on. Next slide. Oftentimes, when we had given our bodies to the wind, and all the shadowy banks on either side came sweeping through the darkness, spinning still the rapid line of motion, then at once have I, reclining back upon my heels, stopped short. And of course the line stops, yet still the solitary cliffs wheeled by me, even as if the earth had rolled with visible motion her diurnal round. Well, I've never felt the motion of the earth, and yet I know I live on a planet that is spinning in the universe. And he felt it. He felt the motion of the earth in its diurnal round. This very powerful part of the poem was inspirational to Seamus Heaney, the famous Irish poet, and we can put this up. Seamus Heaney visited Dove Cottage. I visited that too, of course. And they have a little museum there, and they have some of Wordsworth's things there, his eyeglasses, his handkerchief. One of the things they have are his old skates. And Seamus Heaney, who saw the skates, wrote this short, beautiful poem, which I just thought I'd share with you. They're just 3 stanzas. Star in the window, slate scrape, bird or branch, or the wet and scud of steel on placid ice. Not the bootless runners lying toppled in dust in a display case, their bindings perished, but the reel of them on frozen Windermere as he flashed from the clutch of earth along its curve and left it scored. It's a beautiful poem, and of course, takes some of the words from the prelude, the wet and the scud of the steel. Then he says, well, you know, we don't care about the skates. What we care about is the feeling he had, the reel of them on frozen Windermere. And such a beautiful ending as he flashed from the clutch of earth. We're all in the clutch of earth. We have gravity, it's clutching us to the earth. And we don't feel that, but he felt it along its curve and left it scored. Now he means, I think, not only the scoring of the skate on the ice, but the scoring of the poem's words, like on a musical score. It's a very beautiful poem. Okay, on we go, a little bit more from the prelude. Well, he says, he could pursue this theme through every change to which the year did summon us in his delightful round. And he says in the next section here, right here, nor sedulous as I have been to trace, what is he tracing? How nature, by extrinsic passion, first peopled the mind with forms sublime or fair, and made me love them. So important for a child. And when one thinks about some of the perhaps ugly things that children see nowadays in our cities, and don't have this gift that Wordsworth had, peopled the mind with forms sublime or fair, and made me love them. May I here omit how other pleasures have been mine, and joys of subtler origin. Well, in the next segment, this is now from book 2. He says, it gets a little bit more philosophical in book 2, and he says, well, this is how it worked on me. Thus were my sympathies enlarged. And thus daily, the common range of visible things grew dear to me. Think about that line. It's simple words, but it's such a brilliant thought. Daily, the common range of visible things grew dear to me. Already I began to love the sun, a light which we behold and feel we are alive. I must say, I feel that these days when many of us are sequestered, what it means to go out and feel the sun and feel we are alive, not for his bounty to so many worlds, but for this, he doesn't care about the sun bringing, making things grow exactly, but for this cause, that I had seen him lay his beauty on the morning hills, and I breathed with joy. Gorgeous. Okay, and the next, and he says, well, how can I parcel this all out? How can I tell you the individual hour in which his habits, the child's habits, were first sown, even as a seed? And then he says, sort of turns to the reader and says to the reader what he's trying to do in the prelude. I have endeavored to display the means whereby this infant sensibility, great birthright of our being, that's the most wonderful thing about childhood. It's the birthright of our being. It's when we first become aware, was in me augmented and sustained. And the next, he says, from that I drink the visionary power and deem not profitless those fleeting moods of shadowy exaltation, but that the soul, remembering how she felt, but what she felt, remembering not, retains an obscure sense of possible sublimity. Human beings are made for sublimity. And he says, if in my youth I have been pure in heart, if mingling with the world, I am content with my own modest pleasures and have lived with God and nature in community, removed from little enmities and low desires, the gift is yours. And of course, the yours is nature's. Okay, and the next, and I love this. This is the ending of book 14. It's in the prelude. He says, then though too weak to tread the ways of truth, this age fall back to old idolatry, we shall still find solace knowing what we have learned to know. And this incredible ending, it talks to me of his confidence about his poetry. What we have loved, others will love, and we will teach them how. Instruct them how the mind of man becomes 1,000 times more beautiful than the earth on which he dwells. Above this frame of things, which mid all revolution in the hopes and fears of men, that still remain unchanged, in beauty exalted as it is itself of quality and fabric more divine. Now, he says here in that little parenthesis that no matter the revolution in the hopes and fears of men, and he lived through the French Revolution, and he was very enthusiastic about it at first, and then was horrified by the bloody acts of the terror and the guillotine. So he says, amid all revolution in the hopes and fears of men, the earth, it's the earth, doth still remain unchanged. And that's one of the things that people think about today. Are we changing the earth? Can the earth remain unchanged? This is why I gave the title to this lecture of Wordsworth, our contemporary. We are in a later age than Wordsworth, hundreds of years after him, wondering if the earth can remain unchanged or not. All right, that's just a little look at the Prelude. And I want to say, I believe he's more relevant today than ever before. He is really the first one, I guess we would call him a conservationist now. It used to be that a virtuous act was draining a swamp, but that's not true any longer. We are wondering about our environment and the preservation of our environment. And so I think Wordsworth really foreshadowed 20th and 21st century conservation. The other thing he did, and we must thank him for this, he gave the great 19th century novelists one of their great subjects, growing up, maturing from childhood to manhood or womanhood. He knew that people would say that he had talked too much about himself. He said in one letter, "It is a thing unprecedented in literary history that a man should talk so much about himself." But he gave the novelists their subject, like Dickens in David Copperfield. He would be doing much the same thing. Whether he starts David Copperfield saying, you know, whether I will be the hero of my story or not, will the child be the hero of the story? George Eliot in Mill on the Floss, even Tennyson in Memoriam is doing much the same thing. So in some sense, the Prelude is the first coming of age story. It's in verse. It's the portrait of the artist who tells us how he found his direction and his dedication to his art. Well, now we're going to go on to Lyrical Ballads, which was his first, really his first publication. As I said, the Prelude didn't get published really until after he died. Lyrical Ballads in 1798 was published anonymously. It was a joint publication of Wordsworth and Coleridge. They had this absolutely great mutual friendship. They inspired each other. They each wrote some of their best verse when they were together. And the immediate product was this 1798 volume, Lyrical Ballads. It opened, there were 24 poems in it. The first was the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and it closed with Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey. And all but 5 of the 24 poems were by Wordsworth, and they were narratives of humble life. They were absolutely revolutionary poems. Nobody before Wordsworth would have thought to write a poem about a leech gatherer. You know what leeches are, those things that they would stick on people to bleed them. One of his poems in Lyrical Ballads is The Old Leech Gatherer. Well, goodness, Alexander Pope would have been horrified by writing a poem about a leech gatherer. And this poem almost became the equivalent of the French Revolution in literature. It was a revolutionary volume. The great Scottish, well, he was great, he was important, Scottish critic Geoffrey immediately detected that this was a revolutionary kind of poetry, and he attacked it in the Edinburgh Review, which was the big review of the time. And he called it literary subversiveness. And from then on, all the critics followed Geoffrey in a remorseless attack, a vendetta almost, on Wordsworth's poetry. In the second edition of Lyrical Ballads, Wordsworth did put his name on it, but not Coleridge's. And by the way, he took out the Rime of the Ancient Mariner because really the Rime of the Ancient Mariner is a very different kind of poem from most of them. And to the second edition, he added a preface. What were his poems about? Well, it was new subject matter. Some of the titles, Goody Blake and Harry Gill, We Are Seven, The Mad Mother, The Idiot Boy, The Old Leech Gatherer, The Convict. Oh my goodness, nobody had ever written such subjects. But there were also a lot of very interesting nature poems. And I'm going to look at two of them with you. The first is Lines Written in Early Spring. It's also in, it's not iambic pentameter because there's only 4 beats a line, and that's the ballad stanza. There are 4 beats to every line. I heard 1,000 blended notes while in a grove I sat reclined, and that sweet mood which pleasant thoughts. And then the last line was three stresses, bring sad thoughts to the mind. So let's look at this one. I heard 1,000 blended notes while in a grove I sat reclined, in that sweet mood when pleasant thoughts bring sad thoughts to the mind. To her fair works did nature link the human soul that through me ran, and much it grieved my heart to think what man has made of man. I think he's thinking of the French Revolution here. Through primrose tufts in that green bower, the periwinkle trailed its wreaths, and 'tis my faith that every flower enjoys the air it breathes. That's a really startling line. The birds around me hopped and played, their thoughts I cannot measure, but the least motion which they made, it seemed a thrill of pleasure. He's feeling the pleasure in nature, in birds, in flowers. The budding twigs spread out their fan to catch the breezy air, and I must think, do all I can, that there was pleasure there. If this belief from heaven be sent, if such be nature's holy plan, have I not reason to lament what man has made of man? Well, it's a poem about the world of nature, its pleasurableness, the way it takes pleasure. Think about a little bit later, 50 years or so later, 1859, Darwin is writing, and when Tennyson reads Darwin, he says, nature is red in tooth and claw, and we get the survival of the fittest and a whole different view of nature. And another one from Lyrical Ballads is The Tables Turned. And this is a poem of argument. The poet is making an argument, and whether or not we agree with it, I don't know. Up, my friend, and quit your books, or surely you'll grow double. Up, my friend, and clear your looks. Why all this toil and trouble? The sun above the mountain's head, a freshening luster mellow, through all the long green fields has spread his first sweet evening yellow. There's the sun again. Books, 'tis a dull and endless strife. Come, hear the woodland linnet, how sweet his music, on my life, there's more wisdom in it. And hark, how blithe the throstle sings. He too is no mean preacher. Come forth into the light of things. Let nature be your teacher. She has a world of ready wealth, our minds and hearts to bless. Spontaneous wisdom breathed by health, truth breathed by cheerfulness. And this is the very famous stanza. One impulse from a vernal wood may teach you more of man, of moral evil and of good, than all the sages can. Well, you've got to have the vernal wood around you in order to get the message from nature. When you think about what we see on the television about the cutting down of the forests in the Amazon and the despoilation of that land. Sweet is the lore which nature brings. Our meddling intellect misshapes the beauteous forms of things. We murder to dissect. Enough of science and of art. Close up those barren leaves. Come forth and bring with you a heart that watches and receives. Well, that's his message in those poems. In the second edition of Lyrical Ballads, he wrote a preface. It's one of the most famous prefaces about poetry that exists. We don't have time to go into it, of course, but I want to tell you some of the important things it said. It said that poetry should use the real language of men, not exalted language, but the real language of men. It should use incidents from common life, and it should throw over those incidents of common life the coloring of imagination. And he says, what is a poet? And his definition of a poet is a man speaking to men. And here's the very famous definition. You may recognize parts of it. Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion, recollected in tranquility. The emotion is contemplated till, by a species of reaction, the tranquility gradually disappears, and an emotion, kindred to that which was before the subject of contemplation, is gradually produced and does itself actually exist in the mind. In this mood, successful composition generally begins. So poetry begins in the spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions, but you have to recollect them in tranquility. It's not just throwing it out, but recollecting them in tranquility, the important role of memory. Then you remember the emotion, and in that recollection, there comes a recurrence of the emotion kindred to that which was felt before, and actually exists in the mind, and in that mood, composition begins. So that was his definition. As I say, it's very, very famous. And I want to look at a poem now, which was in his volume of 1807 poems, which I think you'll all recognize. I first want you to see this photograph of the area in which Wordsworth and Dorothy were walking. It's Galborough Park, and that's Ullswater Lake. And you see here only a few daffodils, but evidently on the day that they walked through this area, there were quite a few daffodils. So many so that Dorothy recorded it in her journal. And as you look at this picture, I'll read you the entry from Dorothy's journals, his beloved sister. When we were in the woods beyond Galborough Park, we saw a few daffodils close to the waterside. We fancied that the lake had floated the seeds ashore, and that the little colony had so sprung up. But as we went along, there were more and yet more, and at last, under the boughs of the trees, we saw there was a long belt of them along the shore, about the breadth of a country turnpike road. I never saw daffodils so beautiful. They grew up among the mossy stones. Some rested their heads upon these stones as on a pillow for weariness, and the rest tossed and reeled and danced and seemed as if they laughed with the wind that blew upon them over the lake. They looked so gay, ever glancing, ever changing. This wind blew directly over the lake to them. There was here and there a little knot and a few stragglers a few yards higher up, but they were so few as not to disturb the simplicity, unity, and life of that one busy highway. We rested again and again. The bays were stormy, and we heard the waves at different distances and in the middle of the water like the sea. So that's what Dorothy wrote. The famous poem he wrote, sometimes it's called the Daffodils poem, it's probably the single poem by which Wordsworth is most widely known. In fact, in the past century and a half, It has been the most frequently anthologized poem in the English language. Yet, he wrote it 2 years after the experience recorded in Dorothy's Grasmere journal. So let's take a look. We can think back to her description and let's see what he did with it. He had very poor eyesight. Wordsworth's eyesight worsened as he grew older, and he used to call Dorothy his eyes. Anyway, here it is. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For oft, when on my couch I lie in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. A very good paper assignment, which I used to give, is to have students compare and contrast Dorothy's entry in Wordsworth's poem to see what the differences are. And unfortunately, because we're recording tonight, I can't ask you that question live. We maybe talk about it in the chat room later. But anyway, his subject is not the sight of the daffodils only, but what the sight has done to him. And his poem is about what his vision did to him, recollected in tranquility. The word dance is almost in every stanza, and she uses the word dance, of course. But notice in the first stanza, it's a host. A host, there's something vaguely religious about that. And they're dancing. And then in the second one, the number of them, this huge number, 10,000, the abundance of them. And then in the third stanza, he pauses. I gazed and gazed. I mean, he was stunned by the sight. It is one of his spots of time. But the poem is about not the sight, but what wealth the show brought to him. And when he is on his couch, he's not out in Galborough Park anymore. He's on his couch and he's in vacant or pensive mood. Those are not great words. There's an emptiness about him. But suddenly, in thinking about this encounter with the daffodils, they flash upon the inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. We never need to be alone. We never need to be alone. And then my heart with pleasure fills, and he dances with the daffodils, total identification with the event. It's a great poem, absolutely great poem. In fact, every week, every Saturday, the Wall Street Journal in its book section includes a masterpiece that they say they discuss. And one week they discussed I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. It is a masterpiece. And the title of the article is Budding Hope in Hard Times. And the reviewer of this poem ends by saying, what is important about it is the ability to gain heart from what you have seen. That's what makes it valuable to read today. It's useful to remember Wordsworth's belief that even a flower can console and the mind can take sustenance from memory. It's a very, very great poem, very simple, very not too many big words in it, very, very simple, beautiful, beautiful poem. Okay, another one that I would like to look at, he also wrote sonnets. Now the sonnet as a form has been very popular, but it fell out of use in the 18th century. Almost no poet in the 18th century wrote sonnets. Shakespeare wrote about 125 of them. Milton wrote many, many sonnets. And Wordsworth wrote 500. He loved them. He said, it is a pastime to be bound, because there are strict rules about sonnets. You either write the Shakespearean form with 3 quatrains and a couplet, or you use the Spenserian form, which is an octave and a sestet. It has to be done that way. And Wordsworth wrote 500 of them, and some of them are very great. He wrote sequences, and we're going to look at 2 of them very quickly. And the first of them is one that you may have read somewhere. It begins with that great statement. It's simple words. The world is too much with us. We all feel that from time to time, don't we? The world is too much with us. Late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon. Sometimes I think about that, you know, when now people can go out for a while, and I go out and walk on a beautiful day. And sometimes I take my car out, and actually I don't, sometimes I go food shopping, not very much. But when I go past the parking lots of Target and places like that, and I'm not putting Target down, but the parking lots are jammed, and it's a beautiful day. And that's what people are doing. They're getting and spending. They're laying waste their powers. They're not out walking in parks. Of course, America can be very short on parks. In Europe, they're much better about parks. Some way, one of the most brilliant things that ever happened in New York City was somebody took all those acres for Central Park. It's a life spot of the city. So the world is too much with us. We lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon. Exclamation point, he's mad. This sea that bears her bosom to the moon, the winds that will be howling at all hours. Oh, we love the wind. And are upgathered now like sleeping flowers. For this, for everything, we are out of tune. It moves us not. We're on concrete and asphalt, and we're in the shopping malls. Great God, I'd rather be a pagan, suckled in a creed outworn. So might I, standing on this pleasant lea, have glimpses that would make me less forlorn, have sight of Proteus rising from the sea, or hear old Triton blow his wreathed horn. Because in the Greek myths, nature was alive. There were gods in nature, of course. Well, this is a great one. And he wrote so many. I chose just this one. And the other next one, which he wrote, composed upon Westminster Bridge. It's an odd one for him because he did not like the city. He hated the city. And this is a poem about standing on Westminster Bridge. But notice, well, we'll look at it. He says, earth has not anything to show more fair. He loves to begin with an assertion. Dull would he be of soul who could pass by a sight so touching in its majesty. Well, what's the sight? The sight is the city. How odd that Wordsworth finds it beautiful. This city now doth like a garment wear the beauty of the morning, silent, bare, ships, towers, domes, theaters, and temples lie open to the fields and to the sky, all bright and glittering in the smokeless air. So it's the city before it wakes up. It's the silent city. Makes me think of that Frank Sinatra song, he loves New York because it's a city that never sleeps, which is true. I used to stay in New York a lot. I had good friends there, and I would stay in their apartment, and all night long you hear the sirens, that the city never sleeps. But Wordsworth here celebrates the city asleep. Never did sun more beautifully steep in his first splendor, valley, rock, or hill. How he loved the sun and the effect of the sun. Ne'er saw I, never felt a calm so deep. The river glideth at his own sweet will. And now it comes, an ejaculation comes from him. Dear God, the very houses seem asleep, and all that mighty heart is lying still. A beautiful, beautiful sonnet. And one more of these poems from the 1807 volume, The Solitary Reaper. It's got a lot about the same type of poem that we've seen. Some people call it the most perfect of his lyrics. Its diction is absolutely pure, absolutely stunning. It's got a tight structure. And once again, we have the poet seeing something and remembering it. Behold her. Wordsworth walked a lot in Scotland. He loved Scotland and the hills, mountains. Behold her, single in the field, yon solitary Highland lass, reaping and singing by herself. Stop here or gently pass. Don't interrupt it, just watch. Alone, she cuts and binds the grain and sings a melancholy strain. Oh, listen, for the vale profound is overflowing with the sound. So often his poetry asks us to stop, to look, to listen, not to move on, not to hurry. No nightingale did ever chaunt more welcome notes to weary bands of travelers in some shady haunt among Arabian sands. A voice so thrilling ne'er was heard in springtime from the cuckoo bird, breaking the silence of the seas among the farthest Hebrides. Will no one, now, so this is a beautiful song she's singing, but of course, he doesn't know. He either can't hear the words or perhaps it's in a Scottish dialect. Will no one tell me what she sings? Perhaps the plaintive numbers flow for old, unhappy, far-off things and battles long ago. So maybe she's singing something like that. Or is it some more humble lay, familiar matter of today, some natural sorrow, loss, or pain that has been and may be again? Well, he doesn't care. Whate'er the theme, the maiden sang as if her song could have no ending. I saw her singing at her work and o'er the sickle bending. I listened, motionless and still. And as I mounted up the hill, now he's leaving it. The music in my heart I bore long after it was heard no more. It's again a poem of contemplation. He suddenly sees something. It seems to be lowly or unimportant, and he's really making us aware of the importance of contemplation in the conduct of life. The end of life is not action, but contemplation, a certain disposition of the mind to withdraw from the machinery of life and to look at these things, people or nature, and witness this and meditate on it and bring it with you in memory. Well, I don't know that I'll have time to go all the way through Tintern Abbey. It's a very long poem, but we have here one of the very famous watercolors of Tintern Abbey. I visited Tintern Abbey. I brought a group there, and it is a gorgeous ruin. And of course, what is interesting about this is that Wordsworth's poem never mentions the abbey. It's the scene, it's the natural scene. But this, and the subtitle of this poem is composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey on revisiting the banks of the Wye during a tour, July 13th, 1798. So this is the last poem in the original lyrical ballads. So let's take a quick look at it. It really deserves more than a quick look, but it begins with a narrative introduction. And it's such a Wordsworthian moment. He's going back to a scene that he visited 5 years earlier. 5 years have passed, 5 summers, with the length of 5 long winters. And again, he hears the waters, he sees the cliffs, he sees the landscape, he sees the cottage ground, he sees the woods, the copses, the landscape, the hedgerows, the pastoral farms, little wreaths of smoke. The scene is given here the visiting of the Tintern Abbey landscape. Well, he says, though absent long, these forms of beauty have not been to me as is a landscape to a blind man's eye. I was away for 5 years, but oft in lonely rooms and mid the din of towns and cities. Notice din, the towns are always noisy. I have owed to them in hours of weariness, sensations sweet, what he owes to nature, felt in the blood and felt along the heart, and passing even into my pure mind with tranquil restoration. Feelings too of unremembered pleasure, of moving along now to the next slide. These things which may have no trivial influence on that best portion of a good man's life. So what is it that he remembers? He remembers the scene, but he says, I owe to them another gift. I'm in the first stanza here. Another gift of aspect more sublime, that blessed mood in which the burden of the mystery, in which the heavy and the weary weight of all this unintelligible world is lightened. That serene and blessed mood in which the affections gently lead us on until, and what happens? The breath of this corporeal frame and even the motion of our human blood almost suspended, we are laid asleep in body and become a living soul. This is a spot of time. While with the eye made quiet by the power of harmony and the deep power of joy, we see into the life of things. We see an intelligible world, the life of things. And he says, you know, if this is just a vain belief, well, but often in darkness and in joyless daylight, when the fretful stir and the fever of the world is going on, oh, my spirit turns back to you. So he then goes on and says, and now with gleams of half extinguished thought and many recognitions dim and faint, he gets the picture back again. And he remembers what he felt when he saw it first. Next slide. When I first came among these hills and I bounded o'er the mountains. And it's almost like a little summary of the prelude there. And he says, the coarser pleasures of my boyish days and their glad animal movements all gone by, to me was all in all. I cannot paint what then I was. It's gone. He can't go back and feel what he felt ice skating on Windermere. He can't go back and feel what he felt hanging from the rock, or feeling the motion of the earth. He had these feelings. Then, and he's looking back, the sounding cataract haunted me like a passion. The tall rock, the mountain, and the deep and gloomy wood, their colors and their forms were then to me an appetite. And he says, that time is past. And all its aching joys are now no more, and all its dizzy raptures. But he says he's not going to mourn over that. And why? Other gifts have followed. For such loss, I would believe, abundant recompense. Now, what does he have that remains? For I have learned to look on nature, not as in the hour of thoughtless youth, but hearing oftentimes the still sad music of humanity, not harsh nor grating, though of ample power to chasten and subdue. And I have felt, he can remember this, he's felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns and the round ocean and the living air and the blue sky, and in the mind of man, a motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. This is just great writing. Just sit yourself down sometime and see what words you can come up with to describe a moment of great joy, or a moment when you saw the world made sense and everything hung together, and you felt a emotion and a spirit. So he says, that's what he has. He can remember it. Therefore, am I still a lover of the meadows and the woods and mountains, and of all that we behold from this green earth, of all the mighty world of eye and ear, both what they have create and what perceive. So he says, you know, we also create this as well as perceive it. Well pleased, next slide, to recognize in nature and the language of the sense, the anchor of my purest thoughts, the nurse, the guide, the guardian of my heart and soul, of all my moral being. It's a big order that he gets from nature, is it not? Well, he says, now the end of this poem, he gives tribute to his sister, my dear, dear friend, my dearest friend. He was very, very close to Dorothy. They were both orphaned at an early age, and she was sent to live with one family and he was sent to live with another. And when they finally were able to live together, beginning at Dove Cottage, that's the period of his great poetry, and Coleridge is there. He called her his eyes and ears. And it was an extraordinarily close relationship. When he married Mary, Dorothy did not go to the wedding. Can speculate why not, but she did ask him to give her the wedding ring that he was going to give Mary, and she wore it on her hand all that night. So it's a very, very close relationship. And she lived with them. They took care of her all her life. She suffered from a terrible dementia in her later years, and William and Mary took great care of her in her last years. So this poem ends with his tribute to her. Oh, yet a little while may I behold in thee what I was once, my dear, dear sister. What a privilege it was. And he says on the second line, he says, nothing can take this away from him, not rash judgments, nor the sneers of selfish men, nor greetings where no kindness is, nor all the dreary intercourse of daily life shall e'er prevail against us, or disturb our cheerful faith that all which we behold is full of blessings. And so he ends with this encomium to her. And I think we get the end of it on the next slide. And he says, he never wants to forget that on the banks of this delightful stream, we stood together, and that I, so long a worshiper of nature, hither came, unwearied in that service. And he will not forget that after many wanderings, many years of absence, these steep woods and lofty cliffs, this green pastoral landscape were to me more dear, both for themselves and for thy sake. Well, I'm going to conclude with this strange cartoon. Wordsworth made very little money, if any, from anything he wrote, but he wrote a guidebook to the lakes, and it was his bestseller. It went through hundreds of editions, and so much so that it sort of gave birth to the tourist industry. People wanted to come up and see this lake country. And Gilpin, who was an artist and a cartoonist, has this wonderful cartoon of the tourist looking around. Here's the poor fisherman who lives there gaping at him. What is this man doing? Well, he's riding, gaping, looking at the mountains, taking notes in his book. And we see some ladies being brought around by a boat on the river. Ironically, it brought so much attention to the lake country that they wanted to build a railway to go up to the lake country. And Wordsworth was so against that. And he wrote in one of his poems, "Is no nook of English ground safe from assault?" But one of the unintended consequences of the guidebook and people coming to the lakes is astounding. John Muir, the great American naturalist, and Teddy Roosevelt went to the lake country and fell in love with it and suddenly realized that they had to go back to America and preserve the American West. And Muir set out to preserve the Sierra Nevada mountains, the Yosemite area, and he used in his argumentation the Wordsworthian rhetoric. And he was the first to propose a system of national parks in the United States to preserve the wilderness of the country. This movement to preserve started with an appreciation of Wordsworth's guidebook and then Wordsworth's poems. The movement spread to England. There was a movement to protect the Lake District. When Beatrix Potter died in 1943, she left 100,000 acres to the National Trust. And that area, the area of the Lake Country, became a national park. All of this can be traced back to Wordsworth. All of them are legatees of Wordsworth's poetry. In some respect, our national parks are Wordsworth's best idea. One poet wrote, or I think it's a poet who wrote the line, poetry makes nothing happen, but it's not true. In the case of Wordsworth, poetry made some things happen. His poetry made our attitudes to childhood shift, our attitudes to nature, and to the necessity for our connection to our natural surroundings. It's a testimony, and here are some more beautiful watercolors, and I think that's an oil on the bottom, of the scenes in the Lake Country that must be preserved. So why should we care about him today? Because he is at the beginning of the modern period. He saw the potential damage to the tie between us and our environment. And he thought that the poet's job was to bring human beings back into connection with the world. They need to see into the life of things. He knew about the coming of chemicals, towns, smoke. The Industrial Revolution was on the way, and his poetry helped preserve a lot. And I love those last words of book 14 of the Prelude. What we have loved, others will love, and we will teach them how. And I want to conclude just by reading you one very short, late poem. I probably should have put it up on a slide, but I didn't, but it's very short. It's only about 8 lines long. It's the first line of which is its title, My Heart Leaps Up When I Behold. My heart leaps up, and we can look at the picture on the upper right as I read you this. My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. So was it when my life began. So is it now I am a man. So be it when I shall grow old, or let me die. The child is father of the man, and I could wish my days to be bound each to each by natural piety. The child is father of the man, one of Wordsworth's greatest insights. So thank you for traveling through the Lake Country and through Wordsworth's poetry with me. And I think they're going to manage a chat room now. You can ask questions, or I don't know if they can ask them verbally or through the chat room, however.
Yes, we've asked that if you have a question for Dr. Heineman, that you please enter it in the chat and send the message to everyone. We don't have any questions at this time, Doctor, but I do have a question for you.
All right.
I'm interested to know why a poet who, as you described, did not have very much critical success during his time is someone that we study today, centuries later.
Well, sometimes it takes a while to recognize greatness. When Keats died, probably none of his poems had achieved any critical success. He was in such despair when he died. He died very young, 22, 23. And he told Joseph Severin, who was taking care of him, what he wanted written on his gravestone. He wanted to have engraved on his gravestone, "Here lies one whose name is writ in water." And Severin, who recognized Keats's greatness, had the gravestone read something like, I don't know it exactly now, I don't have it in front of you, but here lie the remains of the poet John Keats, who in the despair of his last days asked that this be put on here. So his name is on his gravestone, along with that terrible quote, "Here lies one whose name is written in water." I think that sometimes it's more, not so much the critics who tell us that someone is great, but the populace. People liked Wordsworth's poetry. They could understand it. They could relate to it. One of the things, we have this idea that, our literary canon should only be decided upon by critics, but Shakespeare was appreciated by all kinds of people. We're just in the 150th year of the death of Dickens. And one of the reasons that Dickens's fame after his death fell was because people said, oh, he was just a popular entertainer. Well, people read him, but he isn't great. We have this idea that poetry has to be difficult, that we need a gloss like we need for T.S. Eliot's Wasteland. So I think the reason that he survived and survives today and is a great poet is because he stood the test of time with readers.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we do have a couple questions for you.
Okay.
The first one is, how do today's students react to these poems? Do they get it?
Well, it's very hard to teach the Prelude. It's 14 books long. I have taught it, and I taught it at Framingham State in a course in Romanticism. We are so much the children of Hemingway. We want brief sentences and, let's get to it quickly, and no big books. I haven't time for this. I think but the shorter poems of Wordsworth, yes, they do like, and they can relate to, because the diction is so pure and so simple. But it's hard. It'd be hard for me to teach the Prelude. I don't think I could do it in 4 sessions. Usually my classes are 4 sessions. It would be very tough. So we're in a different world. We have television, we have video games, we have movies, we have all things going on. It's hard to teach these big books, but Wordsworth's short poems, yes, you can teach them and they can get it. And I think the consciousness we have nowadays about the earth and about conservation helps.
Okay. Next question. Who was his wife and how did they meet?
Mary Hutchinson. Well, she was a friend of the family. They were friends of the family, and they, it was through family associations. They lived nearby, and it was a very loving marriage. It's interesting, they have discovered a cache of letters. These letters were not found initially, and they are extremely passionate. There was some periods of time when they were separated, and they're very physical, missing her body and things like that. And she was totally devoted to him. Critics who didn't like him said that Wordsworth had 3 wives, Dorothy, Mary, and Mary had a sister, Sarah, and that was the cause of the breakup with Coleridge. Coleridge was married. He was married to a woman also named Sarah Fricker. And he had 2 children by her. And when he met Sarah Hutchinson, who was the sister of Mary, Wordsworth's wife, he fell hopelessly in love with her and was always haunting, wanting to come over and stay and be near her. And it bothered Wordsworth. And Coleridge was sort of torn apart by this passion that he had for her. And eventually he had stomach issues. And so they put him on laudanum, and he eventually becomes a drug addict, Coleridge. And so the friendship breaks up. It was so sad. He fell in love with Sarah Hutchinson. She never married, and she lived with the Wordsworths for periods of time. So the people who were sort of harsh critics said, oh, Wordsworth has 3 wives, Mary Hutchinson, Sarah Hutchinson, and his sister Dorothy. He was ministered to. Wordsworth was, they also made fun of him, said he is the egotistical sublime. Everybody ministers to him, takes care of him, and so on. And it was true.
Okay. Next question. How did Wordsworth affect Jane Austen and Georgette Heyer?
Oh, Jane Austen, I don't have a lot of evidence. His Lyrical Ballads comes out in 1798. She dies in the early 1800s, I think. I don't know much connection. And certainly Georgette Heyer, she wasn't a great reader of poetry. Her too, she loved Shakespeare, which is poetry, and she loved Dickens. Those were the things that I know she read. I have no particular evidence that she ever read. She might have read them. I'm sure although she wasn't college educated, she was book educated. She read a lot, and she might have read him, but I don't know any mention of him in her work.
Okay, next question. What happened with Wordsworth's French wife and child?
Yes, he went to France as a young man, and she wasn't his wife. He met Annette Villon, fell in love with her, and they had a child. And I think he always meant to marry her. He went back to England when the terror started and the terrible things that were happening in France. He went back to England, and he was totally disillusioned with the French Revolution. And they were considered, they disapproved of the execution of the king and the queen. They thought it was a terrible thing. And so he couldn't go back because it would be dangerous. It was very dangerous. He and Coleridge couldn't go back to France. But after things calmed down, and he always sent money, whatever he could. And he went back several times with Dorothy, not with Mary. Mary never went with him. She knew about it, but she didn't go. And he met his daughter, and he gave her, when she married the daughter, he gave money, a bequest, and I think he sent money as much as he had to Annette Villon, but he never married her. It was not possible.
Okay.
But it was part of his youthful indiscretion, I guess you could say.
Okay, our next question. In Wordsworth's poems, is it always clear, or is it sometimes ambiguous, whether he is referring to the wind in the natural world or the wind in the soul?
I think it's usually clear that it starts in the natural world. Sometimes then it's the spirit then that moves him internally. But I think it always starts in the natural world. There is so much about the breeze, the mission of the breeze and the wind. So I think it's the real world, really, the real wind and the real world.
Okay. Was Wordsworth an influence on William Blake?
Nobody is an influence on William Blake. He was unique. He was a very private, and you never know where to put him when you're teaching. When you're teaching, should I put him at the end of the 18th century course, or should I put him at the beginning of the 19th century? He had many of the same ideas that Wordsworth had, his hatred of the grime of the city, his belief in the spirit of nature in the world and so on. He also had a wife who idolized him and took care of him so that he could write. He was also, of course, an illustrator of his poems. I don't think there was much opportunity for Wordsworth to even see Blake's works. They were not mass published. It's later that he comes into the consciousness.
Okay. All right, and our last question for tonight. Could you please illustrate the iambic pentameter vis-a-vis the prelude? In other words, could you do a brief recitation of meter, emphasis, etc. to illustrate?
Sure. I don't know if you can put one up, but I can take, I've got the prelude here in front of me. Iambic pentameter is 5 beats to a line, okay? So if we go to the very first beginning of the prelude, oh, there is blessing in this gentle breeze, 5. A visitant that while it fans my cheek, 5. Doth seem half conscious of the joy it brings, 5. From the green fields and from yon azure sky. The reason that iambic pentameter, and it's always unrhymed, unrhymed iambic pentameter is blank verse. It's what Shakespeare wrote his plays in. It's what Milton wrote Paradise Lost in. It's what Wordsworth wrote the Prelude. He wrote 2 other long works, The Excursion and The Recluse. They're all 12 books long, but they're really dull, I have to say. I've made my way through them, but I wouldn't teach them. But so it's 5 beats to a line. And one of the things that you could test yourself, if you want to put a tape recorder underneath your kitchen table and record speech, the daily speech patterns, you would find that basically we speak in iambic pentameter. Da-da, 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 short, long, short, long, short, long, short, long, short, long. We don't speak in short, long, short, long, short, long. That's different. That's trochaic. A trochee is da-da, but iam is da-da. And that's how we speak. And even Chaucer. Chaucer doesn't write in blank verse, but he writes in iambs. He writes in couplets. Chaucer wrote in couplets. Each 2 lines rhyme, but there's 5 beats to the line, because that is the way we speak. That is the basic rhythm of our speech. And it is the most popular of the English verse forms.
Great. Well, there's just far too many things